because I've worked with many of you before. So let me just make sure I am presenting, and hopefully you can see the slides now. All right, so been asked to present a topic of project management and security and how these things work together, some of the differences between them, and things as a project manager you should be aware of or know or have some information about from a security perspective, because there's a lot of tie-ins, especially if you're working IT projects. So a little about me. Right now I'm serving as the Chief Information Risk Officer from the Oregon Department of Human Services and the Oregon Health Authority. We're a joint joint group that serves both agencies. I have a team of about 15 right now in my security and privacy office that works with those organizations. I also used to work in a project management office for those organizations as well, and I received my PMP about 8 years ago. And I also received my certification of information security professional, CISSP certification early in 2020. And it was right before the pandemic shutdown. So I think the week after I took it, everything shut down, and anybody who wanted to get their CSSP right after that was out of luck for about 2 months or more because of the difficulty in getting that scheduled. So really got lucky there. One of the questions I get asked most often, because I've taken both exams, is which one's harder? And I wish I could say that there's an easy answer to that. I do think that they're both challenging in their own way. And I think if you have a lot of technical experience, the CISSP can be an easier exam for you, but the PMP, there's a lot of rigid PMI-ness to the exam that you have to know their way of doing things. So they're both equally difficult, but I'll tell you, CISSP is definitely the one that less people get because it is so technical, because it's so regimented in what it covers. There's about 10 times more PMPs than CISSPs. So great exams, both of them, and I'm glad I was able to do both and get both certifications. So I've worked in state government for these organizations for almost 13 years now. I started off doing application development. I've done system analysis. I've been a project manager. I've also managed development teams and served as a strategic manager for the IT organization there. Now, obviously, director of the Information Security and Privacy Office. So it's been a winding road for me, but a good one. But it's helped me get experience in a lot of different areas around both project management and security. So what I'm going to talk about today are a number of topics that kind of bring these two things together. I'll talk about the different triangles we have in both project management and security, the need to shift left, and I'll explain a little bit more about what that means. Talk about your phases and your documents and where security fits into those. We'll go into some high level in terms of talking about security controls, some of the standards and frameworks and things you'll need to know or at least be aware of. And then talk about regulatory bodies, data types, some of the acronyms and terms that you'll probably come across when dealing with security and data. And then we'll also look at risk management and the consequences of not shifting left. And I'll give you a few little resources at the end as well. And we'll have time for questions either after that, or if you have questions beforehand, just let the moderators know and they'll cue me in to answer those. So the first topic, triangles. It's interesting that both project management and security have these triangles, and they both represent similar things in terms of trade-offs. So in project management, obviously, you've got time and schedule, cost and budget, scope, quality as your three sides of your triangle. And there's trade-offs. When you have to increase your scope or your quality, you might have increased cost or need to change your schedule around. Same thing goes for security. We have in security confidentiality, which is all about preventing breaches, preventing leaks of confidential information. We have integrity, which is all about keeping the data true and real. It's avoiding data getting distorted or corrupted. or even changed without the proper authorization to do so. And then availability, which is that usability of data, keeping the systems running, keeping the data available so that people can do whatever it's designed to do in your business. And I'm sure you're all very familiar with all the trade-offs that come in project management, but in security, there's a lot of trade-offs as well. You know, the old joke is if you want to make data really secure, if you want to have that highest level of confidentiality in your data, then you just don't make it available. You shut off all the computers and you don't let anybody in. That protects your data. So there are nuances to changing some of the availability and how it affects confidentiality and integrity. Obviously, key to that is you don't allow access to data, so you don't make it available to people who don't need the data, and that helps keep that confidentiality. But the less people that have availability to data, the less integrity you can have in the data, because if you think about it, data is changing. You know, your address changes, your age changes, your situation might change, and updating those things requires availability of data. So the less availability there is to make the necessary changes to the data, the less integrity it has, because as data gets older, it gets stale and it's not as accurate anymore. So that access to the data can lead to less reliability and less integrity in that data. So that's an interesting thing that, you know, we both have our triangles in project management and security, and they both mean, you know, that we have trade-offs. We have to make decisions. We have to weigh those against how it's going to affect the other parts of both project management and data security. So one of the terms that I really want to get across, and one of the concepts I want to talk about today, is about shifting left. Now, most projects, you start over here on the left with your scope, your initiation phases, you know, those beginning parts of it, and you move to the right to a completed product or something that you're delivering as part of that project work. And what we talk about when we talk about shifting left is bringing in security as early as possible. Some of your projects are going to need to have security from the start in terms of the data that it collects, the information around the project. You want to keep that secure because you don't want it leaked to just anyone. I've been on projects before where things have gotten out prior to when they should have, and people have gotten a hold of, you know, our schedule or our budget, and it's led to unintended consequences because of that. So the more secure you can keep your basic project documents, your basic things that your team needs to run the project, the better off you're going to be. And release it when you need to and when you want to, based on the needs of the project, rather than just being open and accessible to anyone. So that's part of shifting left. The other part of shifting left is looking at what are the security needs of the end product. If you wait until the product is complete, the project is done, just like anything else that you work with on projects, it's much more costly to implement it at the end. After a product is already mostly complete or ready to be released, if you try to implement security at that point, it becomes a much higher cost and a much more difficult thing to do. So if you can shift left on that and bring that into the design, the requirements, even the scope of the project, it really helps. There's a lot of things around what kind of data architecture you're going to need. And that can be the data classification levels, the type of encryption you might need. Those can be dictated not only by the business area, but what regulations, what federal partners you're going to be working with, what other laws might affect that data or that system that you're developing, can have an extreme effect on how the data has to be handled. It can also affect the equipment that has to be used. Certain encryption standards can be run on some equipment and not on others. There's different equipment depending on what kind of access you need to the data. And then background checks. You want to make sure that the people that are going to be working on this project, on the team, with a vendor, etc., have the right level of background checks that are necessary. I've run into it on a couple projects where we've needed individuals to have special clearance in order to access data or access certain parts of a project. And while background checks are relatively cheap in terms of cost, sometimes they take longer. And so it's something you want to be doing as early as possible. And then, of course, when you get to that end point of your project and you deliver it to your customer, if there are breaches, other malware, other things that hurt the project or hurt the product after it's released, the cost is extreme. You know, one data breach can result in a cost easily over millions of dollars. So being aware of that up front, being aware of what levels of security you need early on is really going to help produce a better product and really decrease cost in the long term. And we'll talk a little more about shifting left as we get through this and start talking about the consequences of not shifting left. We'll get a little more into that. So this is probably something all the project managers are very aware of, is these stages of a project. Those phases of initiation, planning, execution, monitor, controlling, and closure. So what's the role of security in this? Well, when we look at initiation, the first thing we want to talk about is the scope. And there should be clues in that scope that highlight what type of data is going to go into it and what level of security might be needed. You're going to decide somewhere in the scope whether this is something internal to your organization, so it's going to need a different level of access controls, or if this is a web application, something that the general public might access, and thus you'll need a different level of access controls. Or maybe you're going to be working between agencies or with other partners, federal partners, and you'll need specialized security controls to exchange data between those. So knowing those from the start can really help flesh out some of the security needs you'll have, some of the frameworks you might need to apply, you know, based on the type of data you'll be using. We'll talk about some of the security frameworks a little bit later, but some of those types of data require very specific frameworks or very specific regulations in order to house that data and utilize that data. So you'll want to make sure to understand that as early as possible so you get the right security experts in there and they have the right information to base their assessment on what level of security is necessary for the project. So we move from initiation into planning, and you'll start implementing some of your project security controls at this point. You'll want to make sure that if your project plan, if your project documents need to be kept securely, that you have the right password protections on it and other security measures to make sure they're not being released widely. You'll want to make sure that you're bringing in security professionals as you start to write your requirements. So the business is going to have their requirements, but as you get through that, you're going to need to bring in some security experts to start highlighting the security requirements for the types of data that might be in there, the levels of data, and make sure that security and privacy experts are in there confirming that the requirements are going to meet the needs of that data. And then the favorite part of any project, of course, is execution, where things actually get done. So you want to make sure that you're implementing any security controls for the product that's going to be there. You're testing for vulnerabilities, doing penetration testing and other forms of testing that will highlight any security vulnerabilities there. You're also going to want to make sure that the data that you're utilizing as part of the testing is secure, either because the data is obfuscated, and I'll explain that term a little more later, or it's just dummy data that doesn't have any real value to it, so it's not going to affect anything if it gets compromised. So you want to make sure you have those things in place and you're working through that as you do your execution phase. Hopefully through all of this in the monitoring and controlling, you're going to have your reports come out. There's going to be a security components on those reports that's identifying, you know, if there's any findings out of the testing, or if there's problems with access controls, problems with the way data is flowing in there and out of the system. You want to make sure that's documented in any reporting that you're doing. And then, of course, closing, which I know at the state is one of those that we all need to improve on. Project closing, I've seen a lot of projects where that phase is very short, and it should be a little longer. But a couple of the main things with security that you want to be doing in that closing phase, you want to make sure any rights that were granted to data, to servers, to systems out there that were implemented just for the sake of doing the project, just for the project team to complete the work, those rights are removed. Those access rights to those systems are removed at the end of the project, because we don't want people to keep building up access rights that they don't have need for any longer. That's really a risk to security. You're also going to want to make sure that any vendors that were brought in to the project, that they don't retain any access to systems that they don't need anymore, unless they're going to continue with O&M support. You're going to want to make sure that any equipment that's stored, any sensitive data, if it's not going to be continued in terms of the operations and maintenance of the product, that gets wiped in the proper way. And there's different standards for how to sanitize data. Sometimes you need to actually destroy the equipment. You can't sanitize it for specialized levels of data. And you're going to want to make sure that any special access rights over the project itself are handled appropriately. And then hand off that security monitoring to whoever is handling the operations and maintenance for the product. So whoever's doing access control for the product, you want to make sure that gets handed off to the right place so that they're not coming back to the project team expecting the project team to go and do something with access rights when this should be part of the actual implementation of the project and should be turned over to someone else who's going to handle that O&M portion. So it moves us over to project documents, writing about security, which everyone loves to do, especially reading about it. It's wonderful. Obviously, you've got your standard documents that you're all very familiar with as far as projects, your scope, your plans, your requirements, etc. So let's start talking about a few of those. Scope, you're going to want to make sure that you're identifying those regulatory bodies and any security frameworks that need to be covered as part of delivering a product for this. Your plan is going to want to make sure it's got the right security experts engaged in the project. So you want to make sure you're reaching out to them to get them involved as part of that. Your requirements themselves need to have not just what the business needs, but what also needs to be there for security in order to deliver a secure product. Your work breakdown structure obviously needs to have any tasks, any work that's necessary in order to meet the security requirements highlighted in there, along with then, of course, your project schedule. When you get to contracts and agreements, this is an area we found a lot of issues with from the security and privacy offices. We've looked at different products or projects over time, is spelling out the responsibilities with regard to security and with regard to access agreements and other things that are necessary to maintain security of a project. So when you're working with a vendor, whose responsibility is it to keep that security? Whose responsibility is it to do those access agreements? Make sure that they are complying with, state laws, state regulations, or your agency policies, but also that they're very much aware of what other responsibilities, frameworks, etc., that are going to be implemented as part of this product, and so that they're adhering to those, not going and doing something they shouldn't be doing or not meeting those security requirements. You're also going to want to know if you're going to need third-party testers and analysts for this project, because many times some of the regulatory bodies will want third-party independent testing of these systems before they're released. Your quality metrics, a lot of those are going to include things around your testing, your vulnerabilities, your risks. You're all familiar with the risk register, highlighting whatever's there for security and privacy risks, both during and as you continue moving the project into O&M. You don't want to lose those. You want the risk register to be something that just gets pushed aside after a project is done, but it's kept going forward, because highlighting those risks, documenting them, is an important part of going forward. Those should be kept up, handed over to whoever's doing O&M on risk management for a product. In my agency, it's our team. We do a lot of risk management as well. I also want to talk about some of these special documents that you might not have heard of unless you're on some of the larger projects. The PI, the Privacy Impact Analysis. This is a very significant document in highlighting any privacy issues with a project or with a system that's being implemented. Going through and making sure if there's any impacts on data release, data confidentiality that might be affected by the product. There's a lot that goes into these documents. I'm not going to suggest that as project managers that you be writing these documents, but you get security and privacy professionals to come in and write these documents. They're very experienced with them. They sometimes get a bit long-winded, but they're pretty good documents to have, and there are certain regulations and standards that require these documents. Some require them just during the project. Some will require them annually or every few years when audits occur, when other events occur. The POAM, the Plan of Action and Milestones, is really important for making sure that you're achieving the authorization from a security perspective that's necessary for a product. We have a lot of federal partners we work with who produce these POAMs and require us to, or produce the audit findings that require us to put together a POAM and document how we're going to respond to audit findings or other security and privacy issues they might have with our system. The SSP is a common one you'll probably see as a system security plan. Every application system that's out there should have an SSP. I know there are many that don't, but this is an important one to get a security professional in there to write this, to document the actual security of the system and make sure that all of that is highlighted in there so that whoever comes in after them can understand what's there in terms of security. Because as audits occur, as other changes occur over time, we need to understand what's in the system for security and what might need to be addressed as regulations change around data and data security.
Hey, Bryant, this is
Yeah.
Doug. Quick question. Around the security, system security plan, if we're doing a project and we don't have the resources to get a third party to come in and help assist that, do you know if the state has any resources?
So the Cybersecurity Services Group in Dsss, in the Enterprise Security Office, they do have BISOs, business engagement or business, I'm blanking on the BISO acronym now, too many of them. They usually have ones that are assigned to different agencies in different areas of the state, and they can help get you in touch with the right people over in that Enterprise Security Office that might be able to help. I know they're a little short-staffed right now, so it might take a little time for them to get the right resources over to you to help with those system security plans.
Okay, thank you.
We've also, as part of some projects, actually looked to contract for some of that work as well. So that's an option too, and why thinking about security early on can help you out in a project, because you might need specialized security resources that your agency doesn't have, and thus you'll need to procure those as part of your project.
Hey, Bryant.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is Arun. My question is just to understand the differentiation between ISPO and CSS. Generally, CSS provides the security requirements. So do you think your requirements will be different than CSS, or will it be somehow bridging across both organizations?
Yeah, ISPO and CSS work very closely together. We align our security requirements. ISPO actually, has moved most of the security resources over to CSS. They took a great deal of our security professionals from our organization. People like Mark Johnston and Sherry Yoakum and countless others have moved over into that area for CSS and become security professionals there. We rely on their statewide standards and other documentation to base our plans on. So the agency security plan for DHS and OHA is actually based on the statewide security plan, and we just tailor that to what our agency needs specifically.
Like, for example, system security plan, on my project, only CSS is engaged. We have BISO involved, and he's responsible for reviewing and approving it. I don't remember. I don't know whether they share the same plan with ISPO, or ISPO has some say, or do they have to review and approve at any level?
It depends on the project. I know for the integrated eligibility project, we've been heavily involved in the system security plan and other documents for that project, but not for all projects, no. It would be nice if they involved us in everything, but neither one of us is flush with resources, so we have to make do with what we've got. So I wanted to talk a little bit about security controls. This is an area that a lot of people not always understand and don't understand from a security perspective how these different areas of security controls fit and what they should be concerned with. So we have three main areas of controls. The first one, physical security. That's pretty obvious to everyone. You know, the locked door, security cameras, card readers to see if you can get into the building, you know, safes, anything that is a physical barrier to getting access to something. That would be a physical control. And certain requirements from federal partners, et cetera, for certain types of data like CGIS and SS, Social Security Administration, those will require specific physical controls around where you can do the work, where you can have the data. Then there's technical controls. These are things built into digital systems, specific computer devices that are barriers to access like firewalls, password standards, encryption, your network controls that are built into those devices, built into your network to try and limit access. Those are your technical controls, and those are a big part of, things that can be used in terms of implementing security on systems and applications. Then you've got the administrative controls. These are usually developed when your technical controls are insufficient or when you have a lot of need for control of people. So these are not things that are going to control computers, they mostly control people. And they detail what those controls are in policies, in standards. We have data classification, which is how we label data to say what security controls should be around it. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So your policies usually hold some type of consequence for an action. So if you break a policy, here's your consequences. And that provides a level of administrative controls to try and prevent people from doing things. They're not terribly dependable. And too often the control is after the fact. So having consequences is great, but that doesn't stop the action from occurring in the first place, like a technical control or a physical control might. So whenever possible, utilize the technical controls and the physical controls to keep your data and your system safe, and only rely on administrative controls when there isn't a way to technically control something. We can't put chips in everybody's head and keep them from opening phishing emails and downloading malware. We've tried, they said no, so we won't do that. So as a project manager, what do you need to know? What information is going to help you determine what controls need to be implemented? Well, some of those things are going to come out of security standards or frameworks and regulations, and some of that should be built into the business requirements for whatever your project is. And so we're going to talk a little bit about some of the security standards and frameworks that are out there. I'm not going to get into a lot of detail here because these are very technical documents many times, somewhat very dry documents, and if you're not a security professional, some of it's not going to mean much to you. So first one I want to point everybody to, if you're working for the state, is that statewide information and cybersecurity standards document. Came out in 2019. I know they're working on updates for it. It very much aligns to some of the other control frameworks we're going to talk about. So it's a great starting point. It's a great document if you need to understand at a technical level the security for our systems. It was created over at DAS by the EIS, Enterprise Information Systems, or Services, sorry. And it's a great document that anybody who's working in IT who's working in a security office should understand very well from a statewide perspective. Some of the other frameworks, that you've probably heard some of these acronyms before, like Nist, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. This is a great foundational document for a lot of other controls. If you read Nist, especially publication 853, you'll see a lot of similarities between it and the statewide cybersecurity standards, as well as you'll see its influence in a lot of regulatory frameworks that come from different federal partners. So Nist is a great foundational document. It is very technical. One of the other ones is CIS, the Center for Internet Security. They have some critical security controls, and they just revised them. I just got an updated version 8 this morning, and they were previously a set of 20. Now they're a set of 18, and they are very specific, easy to digest, easy to read set of controls that any agency or business should implement in order to keep their data safe. It'll cover things like email security, network security, audit logging, the monitoring controlling you should do around those logs, data classification and governance, asset management, how to properly control assets, both software and hardware. So a lot of basic things that all organizations should be doing in order to increase their security. COBIT and ISO are our two other standards that control objectives for information and related technology, and the International Standards Organization, ISO. These standards are not as common in Oregon. You will see them with some federal partners. You'll see them a lot in private business, especially if you have a company that deals worldwide. ISO is a international standard, so very common to see that in global companies. So a little bit more about some of these two, NIST and CIS, because those are the ones you're going to see the most in Oregon. So NIST, it's a wide-ranging collection of information security standards and best practices. It's been developed over decades, so there's a lot of great information in there. They are geared towards mature organizations. It's a very comprehensive document, and so if you're a large company who's been around for a long time and working on security in your IT organization, you'll be looking to that and trying to align as best you can to that. A lot of federal agencies use this, and so they pass those down to us and for some of the regulations and controls that they use for state agencies when we're sharing data with them. The CIS controls are ones we are currently utilizing in the state of Oregon to help agencies control their data, control their systems. And you'll see the Secretary of State's office is actually doing audits aligned to those CIS controls. So if you are lucky enough to get audited by the Secretary of State from an IT perspective, they will be looking towards your alignment to those CIS controls. Right now, they're doing version 7.1 and picking those first 6 controls. They're called the foundational control elements. They're looking for organizations or state agencies to align to those first 6 controls and make sure those are implemented. Even though you might be implementing parts of some of those other controls, Secretary of State's office is focused on those as part of their audits currently. So in terms of regulatory bodies and data types, let's start with the regulatory bodies. You see a lot of symbols here for different federal partners that we work with, from the IRS to the FBI with the Criminal Justice Information System, which is CJIS, the Social Security Administration, and the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services. These are some of the main organizations, federal organizations that I've dealt with at the state in terms of partners there. They, put out sets of guidelines that you must comply with. The FBI, like I said, CJIS. IRS has the Federal Tax Information Guidelines, FTI. CMMS, the Center for Medicaid and Medicare Services, puts out the minimum acceptable risk standards for exchanges, which they shorten to MARS-E. SSA has the Data Exchange Security Guidelines. They didn't come up with a fancy acronym for theirs. But those are some of the federal partners. So if you understand where your data is coming from at the beginning of your project, back in that scope phase, you can go to these organizations and find out what regulations they're going to require, what security controls they're going to specifically require for your data that's going to be in your project. Some other things to be aware of, Hipaa, if you're dealing with PHI, public health or protected health information, you're going to want to be aware of Hipaa and what it covers and what it doesn't. It's not as expansive as people think. It's a much smaller subset of health information. A lot of concerns around Hipaa right now with people getting these vaccination cards and whether it's a Hipaa violation for a company to ask to show a vaccination card if you go into a business, which it isn't, because Hipaa is very strict in what it's about. It's about health information coming from covered entities, healthcare professionals, those organizations that handle data, not about individuals giving out their health information. So there's been some confusion about what that covers. So if you're working with health data, make sure you're talking with somebody who is experienced in Hipaa and how to make sure that any concerns are addressed regarding that in your project. Something you might come across, not as much at the state, I know DMV has had some of it, is Pci Dss, which is all about payment card information. So anytime you have credit card handling, you'll want to make sure your systems are Pci Dss compliant. So like I said before, a lot of these frameworks utilize the standards that we talked about on the last slide, like Nist and Cis, or even COVID in some cases. So if you understand those basic ones, you'll understand a lot of the frameworks that come out of these regulatory bodies. Is there anything more I want to cover there? I don't have a time clock in front of me, so I don't know where I'm at in terms of time.
You're good. It's only 3:40.
All right, good. Hopefully nobody's bored yet, because we're going to get into very dry topics. I did want to cover some acronyms and terms. So PII is personally identifiable information. This is data that could lead to a person being identified. Pretty simple there. Name, social security number, dates of birth, phone numbers, usernames, any kind of ID that somebody has, be it a Medicaid ID or other, those kind of things that help identify a person could be considered PII. You'll want to make sure you're thinking about it in terms of the data being utilized to identify somebody. So some things aren't always thought of as PII, but they can be under certain circumstances. We have a situation where in Oregon, we have very small zip codes. We have zip codes of less than 50 people. So if you have a zip code, an age, and a gender, and you have less than 50 people in that zip code, it's pretty easy to figure out who that is. So you want to be careful about how data is combined together and what's being released, because that can easily lead to PII, even when you don't think that's enough for a PII. If you're living in, Portland, and you get an age and a gender and a zip code, not going to do you any good to narrow it down to a single person. But if you live out near Burns, it's a different story. So be aware of that. Protected health information, PHI, probably a term you've heard of. It's really concerned around that health information that we don't want leaked. So when you can tie health information to a person, that's when it becomes PII. Their diagnosis, treatment, medication, a Medicaid number, things like that can lead to a leak of PHI. But there are other cases too. If you have somebody's name and they're at the Oregon State Hospital, that's PHI, because they're only at the state hospital if they have one of a series of diagnoses regarding some type of behavioral health or mental health issue. And so just knowing that they're at the state hospital is enough to term that as PHI, even though we're not giving out a specific diagnosis or other information. PCI, we've already covered that, payment card industry, so anything around credit cards, debit card numbers, or other payment information. FTI, federal tax information, So security numbers, EIN, things like that, anything that would be on a federal tax disclosure, that's going to be your FTI data. So these are all, pieces of information that you should be thinking about as you go into a project. Do you have one of these data types? And if you have one of these data types, you'll need to think about how that's going to affect what level of security and what individuals will need to bring in to help evaluate a project on the security it needs. One thing we have here in Oregon produced by Dss is these data levels. Level 1, that's what you'll see on the bottom of this screen, is a grid, a matrix of the levels of data. So you've got level 1 published, 2 limited, 3 restricted, 4 critical. I get asked a lot on what type of data is in a system, what level of data is in a system. So discerning between these levels takes a bit of knowledge, experience, and going through a lot of different scenarios of what that data can be used to do. When we get to level 4 data, this is extremely critical data that could possibly, if released, affect the health, the well-being, the safety. It could lead to injury, death, etc. So it's data that needs to be protected at the maximum level. It needs to be carefully restricted. You want to make sure, excuse me, if somebody has access to that data, that they're receiving special training, that there's special methods of approval to get access because of the criticality of that data. Level 3 data, there's a lot of very specific protections you want to have in place there as well. One of the things that I will stress, level 3 data, you should have encryption at rest. And if you don't know what that is, we can talk about that later, or you can get a security professional from your organization or from CSS, and they can work through what levels of encryption at rest you might need for your data. But be aware that matrix is out there. It's accessible on the Dss site. Just look up data classification and Oregon Dss, and you can get to that. Two terms I want to cover. One is obfuscation. I mentioned that a little bit before. When you have data that's going to be accessible by people that aren't in your production systems, aren't supposed to have access to live data, you want to make sure there's some level of obfuscation for it. Basically, what obfuscation is that replacing of sensitive information within data so that it can look like the real information. It can test like it if you have it in a test system or a UAT system, but it's useless in actually being actual data and identifying an actual person or being utilized in any way by a malicious actor. So things like scrambling names and ID numbers and dates of birth in a way that cannot be deciphered or reverse engineered could be a form of obfuscation. Encryption is the ultimate type of obfuscation, where the data is completely undiscernible unless you can break the encryption or have the key to the encryption. So that's an important term when you're doing projects and you want to make sure your data is obfuscated. If it's not going to have the same level of restrictions and protections and access that your live data is going to have. Another term you should know is inference, and I talked a little bit about that when we talked about the zip code. It's the ability to obtain information or data from unrelated or sampled or obscure data. So being able to just get a little piece of something and infer something much larger. So that zip code example in Oregon is a really good one. There's also a funny story about inference around something called the Pizza Index. I don't know if you've heard of this, but a bunch of newspapers that covered the Pentagon and the White House had a pizza index. And what this was is a number that would be obtained through various contacts at pizza restaurants in the capital area in DC. And what would happen is when the newspapers saw the pizza index go up, they would immediately reach out to the Pentagon and the White House and go, what's going on? And the Pentagon and the White House were like, how do they know something's happening? This was a very famous story right before one of the attacks on Iraq. During Desert Storm, is the pizza index went way up, and all the reporters started calling the Pentagon or the White House, going, what are you doing? What's going on? And they're like, how do you know something's going on? It's like, well, the pizza index went up because White House and Pentagon has all of these people working overnight, planning all of this, doing all the logistics, keeping everything compartmentalized and top secret. So they call around and order pizza to be delivered so that they all have food. So this pizza index is a famous case of inference where they weren't meaning to release any data or any information, but all of a sudden, because everybody's ordering pizza, the press knew something was up. So be aware of that. Probably not as applicable to your projects, but it's an important concept to know from a security perspective is inference of data from things you don't intend. So risk management. Well, minimizing risk is obviously a critical thing when we're talking about security, because you're never going to have a system that's 100% secure, especially if you have people involved, because they are the biggest security risk. And not because they want to be, it's just because we're all not perfect and we're usually stressed in a rush, funneling through tons of emails, and we click on the wrong link, we open the wrong email. But the majority of mistakes that people make aren't intentional. They're trying to do their best and they just don't follow the right process, or they're in a hurry. But that's your biggest risk. And so you're going to want to make sure you understand risk in terms of managing it from a security perspective. You'll want to understand what the risk tolerance level is for your organization. So what level of risk in various categories does your agency tolerate? If it tolerates a high level of risk in terms of cost, like, it's got money flowing everywhere, then maybe that's not your biggest concern. If your risk tolerance is very low when it comes to data, when it comes to Hipaa or other regulatory frameworks, you want to make sure to pay special attention to that. So you want to understand where your organization is in risk so that you can apply your security controls in the right way. So you've got to identify those risks, go through all of the analysis to determine probability and impact. That gives you your risk level. You want to make sure you're prioritizing those risks, so you're dealing with the highest level risks first, or at least putting the most resources to those. You'll want to go through those common mitigation strategies for risk. You can assume or accept the risk and just let it happen, or you can transfer it. You can get insurance or other ways to transfer the risk to a vendor or someone else. Avoid the risk entirely. Maybe there's a part of the scope of your project which is just going to introduce too much risk that your business or organization isn't going to tolerate, so you avoid it. You eliminate that scope, or reduce or control it in some other way, either through increased focus on it in the project, increased resources, or other controls like we talked about with physical, technical, or administrative controls. So implementing those mitigation strategies obviously can have an effect on your budget and your schedule. So you want to make sure to put those into your project plans as early as possible, so that you're not surprised by those later and they're not negatively impacting the project as you go forward. Obviously, dealing with those things up front is going to be the biggest help for you. You want to make sure you're updating that risk register at every step of the project, at every phase, so that you're keeping everyone informed of any risks, of any changes, monitoring for any new risks that come up. Make sure that your mitigation strategies are still having the effect that they were supposed to have. Sometimes during a project, you might implement a mitigation strategy at one point. As you go through the project, it might become less effective unless you need other mitigation strategies to keep that risk from occurring, to keep that whatever the issue is from actually occurring. So since babies scare me, I love to use this picture because, it's the ultimate fear for me. So I use this to scare everybody when I do slide presentations. So hopefully you're effectively scared by the little baby. And this is all about talking about the consequences of not shifting left, not bringing security into that early part of that project and continuing it throughout your project. So obviously security deficits, they can cost significantly more the later you implement them. If you try to do something like encryption at rest required for level 3 data at the end of a project, it will cost you 10 to 100 times more than if you implement it at the beginning of the project, because there are many times there are data architecture and other access control problems with implementing encryption at rest after a product is already complete or almost complete. Leaking of project information, you can have significant perception problems from the public. You can have the integrity of the project data corrupted. Just because it's leaked, because people get a hold of it that really shouldn't. Maybe you've got a project that you have, projected out in a certain way, and certain things might not come to fruition. So you don't want that getting out there until those things have actually come to fruition. And I had this happen many, many years ago on a project where we put out a date just internally on when something might happen, but it was dependent on about 6 other things happening before it. Well, somehow that date went from my manager upwards and got into a Secretary of State report. And so all of a sudden we were beholden to that date, even though these 6 other things that needed to happen weren't actually happening at the time they were supposed to happen. So it created a lot of issues for us. So make sure to keep your project information protected at the right levels so that you don't end up with a situation where stakeholders or others have unrealistic expectations or are getting an incomplete picture of what's going on with your project. Obviously, when we talked about those regulations, those mandates that come from federal partners and others, if you have non-compliance with those, it can result in serious problems like fines or penalties or rework. There was a project that didn't implement a disaster recovery solution in time, and one of our federal partners pulled money back from the program because we didn't have a DR system in place. And they held that money until we got further along with the DR system, and then things worked out after that. But recognize that if you aren't conforming with whatever regulations or mandates, especially in terms of security, come from our federal partners, it can result in some of these things happening to your agency. And then, of course, as you implement a system, as you put it out there in the real world, any type of security problems that a system has exposes it to breaches and malware and service attacks that can affect that confidentiality, integrity, and availability of your data. Can lead to huge costs, not just in dollars, but in reputation and in the business being able to do what it needs to do. So be aware that, not shifting left, not bringing security in earlier can have extreme costs later on, either during the project as you're going forward, or even after the project if you don't have those security controls in place. So that's just there to scare you, to try and convince you to bring security in as early as possible into your projects, because we do like to be involved early. We can do the most good when we're brought in as soon as possible in a project, so we can help guide the project along the right road for security and privacy.
Hey, Bryant, real quick.
Yeah.
There's a question here. What would you say are the most common security issues that projects run into?
The most common security issues are not understanding the data that they have and the requirements that are going to be on that data as they go forward. So when you start doing a project, you're dealing with dummy data, you have fake stuff in there sometimes, and it doesn't appear as risky as it does when it's actually live data in there. So bring a security expert in as soon as you can to really evaluate the data, evaluate the level of that data, because it's not always as easy to look at a piece of data and say that's level 2 data or that's level 3 data. Sometimes it's the totality of the data, because of those things like inference and other aspects of data that really require a security expert to look at it and know, yes, that's going to be level 3 data because you have this element, and this element. We actually, in our privacy team that I run, we have a tool that we implement certain factors into when we have a suspected security or privacy event. And it will tell us, well, you've got X, Y, and Z, so that means it's this problem. Or you only have X and Z, so it's a little less risk. And so having a security or privacy expert can help tell you what risk is there. It's not something that's always easy to see.
Okay. And then another question. So what do you do if there is a breach? Going back to the risk here, what do you do if you discover a breach in your project?
Report it as soon as possible to the right security professionals or privacy professionals, either in your organization or at cybersecurity services. I know not every state agency has a lot of security or privacy resources. DHS OHA is lucky enough to have a security privacy office. So most of those breaches get reported to my team, and we will then reach out to cybersecurity services as necessary in handling that. When you have a breach, having security experts in there to evaluate the scope of a breach, one, you don't want to declare a breach unless you're a security expert. What you want to do is say we have an event and we need a security expert in there to evaluate if this event actually caused a compromise in the data, either confidentiality, integrity, or availability. Some of it's fairly obvious, some of it not. So you want to make sure to get those security incident experts in there to evaluate that and declare an incident and possibly a breach. And then there's various steps you will take depending on the level of the breach. If you have a breach of 5 people, it's a very different set of things that you'll do if you have a breach of 5,000 people. And it can depend on the state. We had a major breach that I dealt with, and we had to go through state by state by state based on where people resided. And look, okay, we had 100 from New Hampshire. Their laws say you have to have over 250 before you take this step. Massachusetts, if you had 50 people, you have to take this step. So each state has its own laws, and you'll want to make sure you have the right experts in there. Get DOJ involved as well, and cybersecurity services will usually do that in the case of a breach, but make sure you get those right partners involved in order to handle it correctly, because there are different rules and different laws based on the type of data, based on the number of people or factors that were affected in the breach. So it can be fairly complicated as you process through those.
Sounds good. Thank you.
So I did want to point out some resources here. Obviously, cybersecurity services, there's their link that you can get to their page on the net. ISO has an information security and project management section as part of 27001. So that's a much larger document, but they do have a section on information security and project management specific to that discipline. CISA, which is the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, it's a federal partner. I was actually just meeting with them before this presentation. They have a lot of free services. We have a representative for District 10, which is the federal district that we're in, and Teresa Massey, and she works with us a lot on different cybersecurity things, providing resources to us. We're going to do a tabletop exercise later this year to test our incident response planning with them. They also do some penetration testing and other things free of charge for state government. So reach out to them if you need some extra security resources. They're a great agency to work with. There is one certification that combines both security and project management. I think it's the only one in the industry, and there's a link for it there. If you wanted to get something that was combined, that would be a place to go. If you already have your PMP and want to get heavily into security, you could go for a CISSP, or there's a couple of other specific security certifications. There's one for security management. There's one for cloud security. There's a whole bunch of different security certifications out there. But if you already got your PMP and looking for more certifications, maybe you're a certification junkie, there are a lot of them out there. And if you want to talk about any specific ones, feel free to reach out to me. I have some people on my team that have a significant number of security certifications, and we can talk about it and let you know which ones are the best ones and are worth the time.
Okay. Sean has a question.
Sure.
Go ahead, Sean.
Hey, Brian, how are you today?
Good. How are you doing, John?
I'm doing fantastic. Quick question I have regarding the opposite kind of a breach, which would be kind of a ransomware attack. So I'm kind of wondering what can we do to ensure that our projects are secure from ransomware attacks? And if we do experience a ransomware attack, what are the procedures that we should be following upon notification that we are under that attack?
So I'll tell you, this is the one that wakes me up at night the most.
Yeah, I know.
It has had me wake up in cold sweats before. What can you do for a ransomware? Well, understanding the nature of a ransomware, they're trying to get your data and sell it or prevent you from doing anything with it. In the event of them trying to get it and sell it, you've got to have upfront protections. You've got to make sure you have the encryption at rest, encryption at transit, that your systems are blocked off to just the access they need. Sean, you might have heard we're doing geofencing and geoblocking at DHS and OHA.
Yep.
Where we are trying to limit the access from outside the US to our systems, because Lagos, Nigeria, Thailand, London, these places don't need our data. They don't need access to them, a vast majority of it. So the more we cut them off, the less likely we're going to get attacked from there. It's not foolproof, but it's one level of control. It's part of those CIS controls that we talked about. So control that access. Make sure that people can't get to your data, or if they get to it, it's encrypted and they can't do anything with it. The next part of that is that other side of things where they prevent you from doing anything with it, and then they try to hold you at ransom, which is why it's ransomware, so that you pay them in order to get access to your data. So what they do is they have a system or a malware that comes in and actually encrypts your data in a special way that they have the key for. So you can't get access to your data because it's encrypted by them. Even if your data is already encrypted, they can still do this. So just because you encrypt your data doesn't prevent them from re-encrypting it and doing some other things to further lock it down and prevent you from getting access to it. So one thing you can do there, and this is something everybody should be doing with all their systems, is have a good business continuity plan and have really strong disaster recovery isolated from your live system. Because if you can take your live system and throw it away and stand up your disaster system, so your disaster recovery system, bring it in, stand it up, that ransomware is useless. They don't have any hold on you because you've thrown away what they did. So they came in and they trashed your building or they trashed your server. You just stand up a new one and you're up and running. You might lose an hour or two of data if you've got a really good high availability data system or data recovery system, but you're not going to be beholden to somebody to unencrypt your data at that point. So those are two things that I strongly recommend. Protect your data as much as possible, but have a really good backup system and data recovery system.
Okay, and if we don't have that in place and we are in a situation where we do want to be able to get the data back for whatever reason, do we reach out to DOJ, to governor's office? How do we actually follow the proper procedures to get the right people engaged from cybersecurity, from your office, from other offices and other agencies, potentially maybe at the federal level as well?
So the minute you suspect any type of attack or breach, so a security event of any type, you'll reach out to my office. Obviously, right. Sean, I know you work in DHS OHA.
Yeah.
So you'll reach out to my office and we will reach out to cybersecurity services. If you're in a state agency that does not have its own security office, reach out directly to cybersecurity services, engage with them to start the process rolling. They will, just like my office would, we would get DOJ involved. We contact Oregon State Police, FBI, and a whole slew, Attorney General's office. We have a whole slew of things that we do when an event occurs, depending on whether it's declared an actual security incident. And ransomware would definitely be a security incident.
Thank you. That's very helpful. I appreciate it.
It shouldn't be on the business. It shouldn't be on a project manager to take those additional steps. You should be able to contact a security professional to go and make that additional stuff happen, because there's very specific things that need to occur.
And I'm assuming that if this does happen while we're on watch, that we kind of keep it on the lowdown, right? Because this is something that we don't want to publicly announce to our constituents that are using our systems that, hey, we can't use it right now because of this?
They will find out. But yeah, we do not want to spread, anytime we have an incident or an event, we keep it, to who needs to know. Now, there are specific notification requirements. You might have seen that with previous incidents we've had, previous breaches, where we'll put notices out to the media. There'll be other communications. For our larger breaches, we sent individual letters to each person that was suspected to have been involved in their data being breached. So there are specific steps that we will take to make sure people are notified at the right time and in the right way. What we don't want to do is spread mass panic, because many times what we find when we go through an incident response is that the number of people or the data that's affected is much smaller than what we initially might suspect. In some of our breaches, what actually comes out when we do all of our analysis, investigation, data mining, etc., is the number of individuals affected by a breach is about 10 times or less smaller than what the initial scope is suspected to be. So make sure to get the right professionals involved before it gets out of control or gets out to anyone that it shouldn't be. That's real important to control that information so that the right people can be informed and take the right level of action that's appropriate.
All right. Does anybody else have any other questions for Bryant while we have him here? All right. Crickets is what I hear.
Are they awake?
Well, I just want to say I hope that you gained a greater understanding of the role of security with project management, and say thank you for attending. You can look for a follow-up email with links to the resources and a short survey that can help us improve the PMUG experience and future PMUGs. And I did just put in the chat a little comment. If you have any questions, my email's there. And please send an email to me and let me know if you happen to be in a different PMUG room today. We want to make sure that you get the most up-to-date information and meeting invite. With that, we are done and you're free to go and enjoy the rest of the week. Thanks again, Brian, and thank you for everyone.
Thank you. Have a good one.